Klaus stood behind the barbed wire fence and stared at the Wisconsin countryside rolling out in every direction. Endless fields of corn and dairy farms, red barns, white churches with tall steeples. It looked nothing like the desert where he'd been captured in North Africa, nothing like the war-torn Europe he'd left behind. It looked peaceful, safe, almost like home, except everything was bigger, greener, more abundant than anything he'd known in Germany. He was a prisoner here, an enemy, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel afraid. 2 years later, he'd be gone, shipped back to a Germany that no longer existed. And 3 years after that, he'd returned to Wisconsin, not as a prisoner, as a neighbor. Before the war, Klaus had been a farm boy from a small village outside Stuttgart. His father raised dairy cows, his mother kept a garden. He went to school, helped with the chores, and imagined he'd take over the farm someday. Then Hitler happened, then conscription, then North Africa, where his unit surrendered to American forces in 1943. He expected a prison camp to be brutal, bars, beatings, starvation. Instead, he got Wisconsin. The camp sat on the edge of a small town surrounded by farmland. The barracks were clean. The food was better than anything he'd eaten in the German army. And within weeks, he was being sent out to work on local farms, harvesting corn, milking cows, fixing equipment. The farmers needed the help desperately. Most of their sons and hired hands were overseas fighting. So the German prisoners filled the gap. And something strange happened. They were good at it, really good. Klaus had grown up around cows and tractors. He knew how to time a harvest, how to handle a plow, how to fix a busted engine with wire and patience. The farmer he worked for, a man named Ed Johnson, whose son was somewhere in France, watched Klaus for a few days and then stopped watching. He trusted him. They worked side by side, and even though Klaus's English was terrible and Ed didn't speak a word of German, they communicated well enough. A gesture here, a nod there. Work that needed doing got done. The townspeople didn't know what to make of the prisoners at first. These were Germans, the enemy, the people their boys were fighting and dying to stop. But the prisoners didn't look like monsters. They looked like tired young men who were relieved to be somewhere that wasn't a battlefield. They were polite. They worked hard. And slowly, the hostility softened into something more complicated. Klaus started going to church socials. Supervised, of course, but the guards were local boys who didn't take the job too seriously. And that's where he met Dorothy. She was 19, worked at the local canning factory, and had a brother serving in the Pacific. By every measure of logic and loyalty, she should have hated Klaus. Instead, she smiled at him across the church hall, and he smiled back. The relationship caused a scandal that rippled through the entire county. People whispered. Some called Dorothy a traitor. Others said Klaus was taking advantage. Her parents were furious, but Dorothy didn't care. She saw past the uniform with POW stenciled on the back. She saw a boy who missed his family, who hated the war as much as anyone, who wanted nothing more than to go home and live a quiet life. They talked whenever they could, stolen moments at church, brief exchanges when he worked near the factory, letters passed through sympathetic guards. By 1945, Klaus had been in Wisconsin for 2 years. The war in Europe ended in May, Japan surrendered in August, and the prisoners waited to go home. Repatriation took time. The ships were busy bringing American soldiers back first. So Klaus kept working on the Johnson farm through the fall, through the winter, into the spring of 1946. And every week he saw Dorothy. And every week it got harder to imagine leaving. Finally, in July 1946, the order came. The last major group of POWs was being shipped out. Klaus packed his few belongings, said goodbye to the Johnsons, and promised Dorothy.
He and Dorothy bought a small dairy farm with money they saved and a loan from Ed Johnson. Klaus became an American citizen in 1953. He learned English, though he'd never quite lost the accent. He raised 3 kids who grew up speaking English and eating bratwurst, and every Sunday he went to the same church where he'd once sat as a prisoner, and no one said a word about it anymore. It wasn't easy. There were people in town who never forgave him for being German, for representing an enemy that had cost them sons and brothers. There were nights when Dorothy cried because her brother came home from the Pacific broken and angry and couldn't understand how she could love the enemy. There were moments when Klaus felt the weight of what he'd been, not what he'd done because he'd never hurt anyone, but what he'd represented. The uniform, the flag, the side of history he hadn't chosen but had been born into. But he built a life anyway. He milked cows every morning at 4 a.m., he fixed fences, he helped his neighbors when their equipment broke down, he coached Little League, and slowly, the fact that he'd once been a prisoner of war faded into the background. People forgot or stopped caring or decided it didn't matter anymore. Klaus wasn't alone. About 5,000 German POWs found ways to stay in America or return after the war. Some married American women, some were sponsored by the farmers they'd worked for. Others simply couldn't face going back to a destroyed Germany and rebuilt their lives here instead. And thousands more returned to visit years later, coming back to the farms they'd worked, the towns they'd known, the people who'd treated them with unexpected kindness. In the 1970s, a few former POWs were even given keys to the cities where they'd been held, honors that acknowledged the strange, complicated relationships that had formed during the war. One former prisoner summed it up perfectly in a newspaper interview. "If there's ever another war, get on the side that America isn't, then get captured by the Americans. You'll have it made." Klaus lived until 1989. He died in the same farmhouse he and Dorothy had bought 40 years earlier, surrounded by children and grandchildren who barely knew he'd once been an enemy soldier. At his funeral, the church was packed. Neighbors, friends, fellow farmers, all there to say goodbye to a man who'd become one of them. Dorothy lived another 20 years, and when people asked her about the war, about how she could have fallen in love with a German prisoner, she'd just smile and say, "He was never the enemy. He was just a boy far from home, same as any of them." From enemies to neighbors, from prisoner to friend, from the other side of a barbed wire fence to the farm next door. Klaus's story wasn't unique. Thousands of former POWs followed similar paths, rebuilding lives in the country that had once held them captive. But every one of those stories was a quiet rebellion against the simplicity of war, a reminder that people are never as simple as the sides they're on. The barbed wire came down, the camps were torn apart, the uniforms with PW stenciled on the back were burned or buried, and what was left were just people, trying to survive, trying to build something, trying to figure out how to live with the fact that the world had asked them to be enemies when all they'd ever wanted was to go home. Klaus did go home. It just turned out that home wasn't where he'd started. It was where he'd been a prisoner. And somehow that made all the sense in the world.